long before the land we now call Oklahoma was divided into counties, before roads crisscrossed its prairies and cities dotted its hills, this place was ancient, untamed, and alive with rhythms of nature that had shaped it for millions of years. To begin the story of Oklahoma, we must first imagine a time when seas covered its rolling plains, when shallow waters teemed with marine reptiles and fish, and when vast forests rose and fell with changing climates. The fossils still buried in its soil tell of creatures long gone. Giant mosasaurs that swam in inland seas, mammoths that grazed on grassy plains, and saber-toothed cats that stalked the valleys. This was a land shaped by geological upheaval, carved by rivers, and tempered by fire and wind. It is into this ever-changing stage that the first humans would eventually arrive. Archaeologists believe the people first set foot on Oklahoma's soil more than 12,000 years ago, during the last ice age. These were the Paleo-Indians, small bands of hunters who followed the great herds across the continent. Evidence of their presence has been found in the form of Clovis points, finely crafted stone spear tips discovered in sites near Cooperton and along the Canadian River. These tools, sharp and carefully fluted, speak of a people skilled in survival, able to bring down mammoths and bison with courage and cooperation. Imagine for a moment what life must have been like for these early hunters. They moved in small family groups, carrying only what they needed, following the animals that sustained them. A kill meant meat, hide, bone, and sinew, all used with remarkable efficiency. Nothing was wasted. Fire crackled on the open plain as families gathered to cook, to tell stories, to repair tools, and to plan the next move. Their world was vast and uncertain, but they had learned to read the land, to follow tracks in soft earth, and to sense the change of seasons. As the climate warmed and the giant Ice Age mammals disappeared, the people adapted. They turned their skills to smaller game, deer, rabbits, turkeys, and expanded their diets with seeds, roots, and wild plants. Over time, cultures developed new tools and new ways of life. The archaic peoples, who lived in Oklahoma thousands of years after the first hunters, were experts at survival in a changing environment. They invented grinding stones for processing seeds and nuts, crafted fish hooks and nets, and built shelters suited to the varied climates of the plains and woodlands. Archaeological sites such as the Spiro Mounds in eastern Oklahoma reveal just how sophisticated some of these cultures became. Around 800 CE, Spiro became one of the most important ceremonial centers of the Mississippian culture, which stretched across much of North America. Here, on the banks of the Arkansas River, people constructed massive earthen mounds that served as platforms for temples, council houses, and burials. The great mortuary at Spiro contained treasures that spoke of a vast trade network. Seashells from the Gulf of Mexico, copper ornaments from the Great Lakes, obsidian from the Rockies, and finely woven textiles that survived centuries buried in the earth. These discoveries show that the people of Oklahoma were not isolated. They were connected to distant cultures, exchanging goods, ideas, and traditions. The artifacts also reveal a rich spiritual life, with symbols of the sun, moon, animals, and mythical beings carved into shell and stone. The Spiro Mounds stand as a reminder that the early peoples of Oklahoma were not simply surviving. They were thriving, building communities, and shaping a culture that valued both the practical and the sacred. by the time Europeans first glimpsed the plains in the 1500s, many tribes had made this land their home. The Wichita people lived along the rivers of central and southern Oklahoma. Their round grass houses clustered in villages surrounded by fields of corn, beans, and squash. They were skilled farmers and traders, known for their tattooed faces and their hospitality. To the east, the Caddo people built complex chiefdoms, their societies organized around agriculture, artistry, and trade. In the west, Plains tribes hunted bison, adapting to a life of movement across the wide grasslands. The land itself shaped these cultures. In the east, forests offered deer, turkey, and fertile fields. In the west, the endless plains demanded mobility and endurance. The rivers, Arkansas, Canadian, Red, were lifelines, carrying goods and stories from one community to another. The cycles of drought and rain, fire and renewal, taught the people resilience. Their traditions reflected this deep bond with the earth, with ceremonies tied to planting and harvest, to hunting and the seasons, to the balance of life and death. Even in their diversity, the tribes of Oklahoma shared a profound respect for the land. To them, the earth was not just a place to live, but a living entity, sacred and sustaining. Animals were hunted with ritual, crops were planted with gratitude, and stories carried the wisdom of generations. These traditions anchored them to the land and to each other, weaving a fabric of identity that endured through hardship and change. It is easy when looking back across millennia to imagine these early peoples as distant, shadowy figures. Yet they were not so different from us. They loved and mourned. They hoped and struggled. They passed knowledge to their children and sought meaning in the stars above them. Their footsteps are still here, in the trails that cross the hills, in the stone tools that surface after rains, in the mounds that rise quietly from the earth. The story of Oklahoma begins with them, with the hunters who stalked mammoths across frozen plains, with the farmers who coaxed life from the soil, with the builders of mounds who honored their dead and celebrated their gods. It begins with the tribes who called this land home, who gave it its first names, and who left their mark on its rivers and valleys. But history is never still. Far away, across the ocean, forces were stirring that would soon ripple outward and reach the heart of North America. Explorers, driven by ambition, empire, and curiosity, would set foot on these lands. Their arrival would bring change unlike any the first peoples had ever faced. The era of ancient Oklahoma was about to meet the world beyond, and the story would enter a new and turbulent chapter. When the first Europeans set their eyes upon the plains and woodlands of what would one day be Oklahoma, the world was in the midst of great change. Across the Atlantic, kingdoms and empires were expanding, driven by ambition, religion, and the promise of wealth. Ships were crossing oceans in search of trade routes and treasure, carrying with them not only explorers, but also soldiers, priests, and settlers. For the peoples of North America, including those who lived in the heart of the continent, this era marked the beginning of a profound and often devastating transformation. The story of European arrival in Oklahoma begins with the Spanish. In 1541, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado, leading an expedition northward from Mexico, became one of the first Europeans to enter the southern Great Plains. His men were searching for the fabled 7 cities of gold, legendary places said to hold unimaginable riches. What they found instead was a land vast and windswept, dotted with bison herds and inhabited by resilient native peoples. Coronado's journey took him across the Texas Panhandle into western Oklahoma, where he likely encountered the grass-covered plains and the tribes who lived there. For Coronado and his men, the landscape must have been bewildering. Accustomed to the mountainous terrain and deserts of New Spain, they now faced horizons that seemed endless. They wrote of grasses so tall they brushed the bellies of their horses, of skies wide and unbroken, and of herds of bison that stretched farther than the eye could see. The Spaniards marveled at the animals, which they compared to the cattle of their homeland, though larger, shaggier, and wilder. They met people who hunted these herds with skill. And though no gold was found, Coronado's expedition marked the beginning of European knowledge of Oklahoma's land and peoples. Though Coronado soon returned south, the Spanish presence lingered in memory. For the next century and a half, Spain claimed vast portions of the North American interior, including the plains of present-day Oklahoma. Their primary interest was not in settlement, but in securing territory against rivals and maintaining control of trade routes. Catholic missionaries occasionally traveled into the region, seeking to spread Christianity. But the heart of Spanish influence lay further south in Mexico and the American Southwest. In time, another power entered the story: France. By the late 1600s, French explorers had pushed down the Mississippi River, claiming lands in the name of King Louis XIV. The French interest in the interior was largely economic, focused on the fur trade. Traders and trappers built relationships with native nations, exchanging goods such as metal tools, beads, and firearms for valuable pelts. French influence extended into the Mississippi Valley, and soon traders were making their way along the Arkansas and Red Rivers, weaving Oklahoma into the wider network of New France. The French approach differed from that of Spain. Rather than attempting conquest or conversion on a grand scale, they relied heavily on alliances with native peoples. They learned languages, took native women as wives, and integrated themselves into local communities. In return, tribes gained access to goods that altered daily life: iron axes, knives, kettles, cloth, and above all, guns. These new tools and weapons changed the balance of power between tribes, leading to shifting alliances, new opportunities, and deadly conflicts. The 1700s were a century of flux in Oklahoma. The land itself remained largely under the control of native nations, but European rivalries rippled outward, touching the tribes in complex ways. Spain held claim from the southwest, France from the east, and England from the far southeast. Each empire sought to extend influence, but none established permanent colonies in Oklahoma during this time. Instead, the land became a borderland, a crossroads of power where native nations negotiated, resisted, and adapted. For the Wichita and Caddo peoples, European contact brought both opportunity and danger. Trade introduced new goods that made farming and hunting more efficient, but it also brought disease. Smallpox, carried unknowingly by European explorers and traders, swept through native villages, killing thousands. Entire communities were devastated, and the survivors faced a world forever altered. Diseases moved faster than the Europeans themselves, often reaching tribes long before direct contact. By the time some French traders met certain peoples of the plains, they had already endured waves of illness. Yet native resilience endured. The tribes of Oklahoma adjusted to the new realities, adopting horses brought originally by the Spanish into their cultures. By the 1700s, the horse had revolutionized life on the plains. Tribes such as the Comanche, who migrated southward, became powerful equestrian peoples, using horses to hunt bison more effectively and to wage war over larger territories. For Oklahoma, the arrival of the horse was as transformative as the arrival of Europeans themselves. By the mid-1700s, Oklahoma's land was a place of encounter and contest. French traders ventured up rivers, Spanish officials kept watch from distant outposts, and native peoples navigated the shifting landscape of alliances and threats. Maps drawn in Europe increasingly included the region, though often with little accuracy, labeling it with broad strokes as part of New Spain or New France. In reality, the land remained in native hands. Its rivers, plains, and hills, home to societies that had lived there for centuries. The century closed with a dramatic shift in ownership. In 1763, after the 7 Years' War, France ceded its vast Louisiana territory, including Oklahoma, to Spain. For the next 4 decades, Spain held legal claim over the region, though its presence was thin and its influence limited. Native peoples continued to govern their own affairs, while traders and explorers moved in small numbers across the land. Then, in 1800, Spain secretly returned the Louisiana territory to France, setting the stage for one of the most significant land deals in American history. As the 1700s ended, Oklahoma stood at the threshold of a new era. European powers had touched its borders, shaped its trade, and brought devastating disease, but they had not yet taken control of the land itself. That change would come with the United States, a young nation eager to expand westward. For the native peoples of Oklahoma, the centuries of European contact had already brought challenges. But the storm of removal, settlement, and statehood still lay ahead. The dawn of the 19th century brought dramatic change to the land that would become Oklahoma. For centuries, native peoples had lived and thrived here. Wichita, Caddo, Comanche, and many others. Now, a new chapter was opening, one shaped by the relentless expansion of the United States. As settlers pressed westward, the government sought new solutions to what it called the Indian problem. Those solutions would transform Oklahoma into Indian territory, forever tying its story to one of the darkest chapters in American history: the Trail of Tears. At the heart of this story were 5 powerful native nations: the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole. These tribes, originally from the southeastern United States, had lived in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, and Tennessee. They were farmers, hunters, and traders, with rich traditions and thriving communities. In many ways, they had adapted to the presence of European settlers. They built towns, adopted written constitutions, ran schools, and some even held enslaved African Americans, mirroring the practices of their white neighbors. Because of these adaptations, Americans often call them the 5 civilized tribes. But for all their efforts to coexist, pressure mounted. White settlers coveted their lands, fertile for cotton farming and valuable in a rapidly expanding economy. Politicians spoke of progress and manifest destiny, declaring that native peoples stood in the way of civilization. By the 1820s, calls grew louder for their removal westward, beyond the Mississippi River. The defining moment came in 1830 with the Indian Removal Act. Championed by President Andrew Jackson, the act authorized the federal government to negotiate treaties that forced tribes to give up their ancestral lands in exchange for territory in the West. On paper, it was framed as a voluntary exchange. In reality, it was carried out through pressure, deception, and ultimately, force. The Choctaw were the first to endure removal. Beginning in 1831, they were forced to leave Mississippi and Alabama and march westward to Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. Thousands died along the way, from hunger, disease, and exposure. Their suffering set the tone for what was to come. Next were the Creek, driven from their lands in Alabama and Georgia. Many resisted, leading to violent conflicts with the U.S. military. Ultimately, they too were marched west, their communities shattered, their journey marked by death and despair. The Chickasaw followed, leaving their homeland in Mississippi. Though they negotiated a financial settlement for their lands, the promises made to them were often broken, and they too suffered during the long trek west. The Seminole resisted more fiercely than any of the others. From the swamps of Florida, they fought a series of wars against U.S. troops. Some Seminole were captured and forced west, while others retreated deeper into Florida, where their descendants live today. Those who were removed faced the same hardships as the other tribes, resettled into unfamiliar lands under great duress. The most famous of these removals was that of the Cherokee. In 1838, after years of legal battles, including a Supreme Court case that initially sided with the tribe, the U.S. government under President Martin Van Buren sent soldiers to round up the Cherokee people. Some 16,000 men, women, and children were forced into stockades, then marched on foot across hundreds of miles to Indian Territory. The journey became known as the Trail of Tears. Disease, starvation, and cold claimed the lives of an estimated 4,000 people. The Cherokee remembered it not only as a tragedy, but as a defining moment of endurance and survival. By the 1840s, the 5 tribes had been relocated to Indian Territory, their new lands carved out of what is now eastern Oklahoma. Each tribe re-established its government, built schools, and rebuilt their communities. The Cherokee established a capital at Tahlequah. The Choctaw settled near what is now Durant. The Chickasaw built towns in south-central Oklahoma, while the Creek and Seminole spread out in their designated regions. Despite the trauma of removal, these nations displayed extraordinary resilience. They rebuilt their societies, writing new constitutions, re-establishing trade, and preserving their languages and traditions. In many ways, they turned Indian Territory into a new homeland, one where their cultures could continue and evolve. But the removal also had lasting consequences. The land they were promised as a permanent home was not as secure as they were told. Over time, the U.S. government would continue to encroach on their sovereignty. Yet, in the mid-19th century, Indian Territory became a place of both grief and renewal, carrying the weight of tragedy, but also the determination of people who refused to disappear. The Trail of Tears is remembered as one of America's greatest injustices. But it is also remembered for the strength of those who endured it. The Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole rebuilt from the ashes of loss, planting new roots in Oklahoma's soil. Their story became forever entwined with the land, shaping the identity of the place and its people. As Indian Territory took shape, its boundaries and purpose remained unsettled. The 5 tribes lived and governed themselves, but the pressure of the outside world never relented. New challenges were on the horizon: railroads, settlers, and the storm of civil war. The history of Oklahoma was only beginning to unfold. By the mid-19th century, Indian Territory was beginning to take shape. Though created out of tragedy and loss, it became a new homeland for the 5 civilized tribes and a diverse collection of other native peoples forced west by U.S. policy. This region, covering most of what is now Oklahoma, was meant to be the end of the line, the final refuge for native nations, beyond the reach of white settlers. But in reality, it was not a quiet sanctuary. It was a frontier, a borderland, alive with trade, conflict, and cultural transformation. Life in Indian Territory was as varied as the peoples who lived there. In the east, the Cherokee built towns with log houses, schools, and even printing presses. They published newspapers in both English and the Cherokee syllabary, created by Sequoyah, preserving their language and sharing news across their nation. The Choctaw and Chickasaw re-established farming communities, planting corn, beans, and cotton in fertile river valleys. The Creek and Seminole maintained traditions of council houses and clan systems, blending their ancestral ways with the demands of their new land. Across Indian Territory, tribal governments re-emerged. Constitutions were written, laws were passed, and elected leaders took office. The Cherokee Nation built a council house in Tahlequah and established a system of courts. The Choctaw adopted a constitution modeled in part on that of the United States. In many ways, the 5 tribes proved their ability to adapt while holding on to cultural identity. Against the backdrop of forced removal, they rebuilt with remarkable resilience. Yet Indian Territory was never isolated. Traders, missionaries, and soldiers all made their presence known. U.S. forts dotted the landscape, officially to maintain peace, but in practice to watch over the tribes and secure American interests. Fort Gibson, established in 1824, became one of the most important outposts in the region. It was a hub for trade, diplomacy, and military operations, a symbol of both protection and control. Fort Towson in the south and Fort Washita near the Red River played similar roles, shaping the lives of those around them. The presence of these forts brought new opportunities and dangers. Traders sold cloth, tools, and weapons, but also whiskey, which created problems in many communities. Missionaries arrived to build schools and churches, seeking to convert native peoples to Christianity. Some tribes welcomed the education, while others resisted what they saw as an erosion of their traditions. Meanwhile, Indian Territory became a crossroads for other native nations displaced from across the United States. The Delaware, Shawnee, Kickapoo, and many others were relocated here, joining the 5 tribes in a patchwork of cultures. Each brought their own traditions, languages, and struggles, creating a mosaic of native life unlike any other region in America. Beyond native communities, the territory also became a refuge for people fleeing the boundaries of law. Outlaws, deserters, and traders seeking quick profit sometimes found sanctuary in its relative isolation. The frontier could be a dangerous place. Conflicts broke out not only between tribes, but also among the newcomers who drifted into the territory's margins. Despite the challenges, daily life continued. Families farmed their land, children attended schools, and councils debated laws. Ceremonies were held, dances performed, and stories told around fires. The trauma of removal was still fresh, but the determination to survive and preserve culture burned brighter than despair. Yet the promise that Indian Territory would remain a permanent home was already eroding. U.S. settlers pressed westward, eyeing the fertile lands just beyond the border. Pressure mounted for more access, first for traders, then for railroads, and eventually for settlers themselves. Treaties signed in Washington promised security, but were often ignored or revised when convenient. By the 1850s, the cracks in the vision of Indian Territory as a sanctuary were clear. The railroad companies lobbied for routes through the region, while officials in Washington looked for ways to open more land. Some tribal leaders, wary of further betrayal, sought to strengthen their governments and institutions. Others believed compromise was the only way to survive. This period of frontier life was one of contrasts. On one hand, Indian Territory was a place of rebuilding and renewal. Nations uprooted from their ancestral homes created thriving communities, complete with farms, schools, and councils. On the other hand, it was a place under constant threat, where promises of permanence seemed fragile, and where outside forces loomed ever closer. For Oklahoma, these decades laid a foundation. They showed the strength of its native peoples, their ability to adapt and preserve culture in the face of immense challenge. But they also revealed the instability of promises made by the U.S. government. The era of frontier life in Indian Territory was not the end of removal and struggle. It was only the beginning of a new phase, one that would soon be engulfed by the flames of civil war. When the American Civil War erupted in 1861, its flames spread far beyond the plantations of the South and the factories of the North. The conflict reached deep into Indian Territory, drawing in the 5 tribes and other native nations who had been relocated there only a generation earlier. For Oklahoma, the Civil War was not just a distant struggle between blue and gray. It was a civil war within a civil war. Tribes divided, alliances torn, and the land itself scarred by battle. The seeds of division had been planted long before. In the years leading up to the war, tension simmered in Indian Territory. The 5 tribes had rebuilt after removal, creating governments, schools, and economies. Many had adopted aspects of Southern culture, including the practice of slavery. Wealthier members of the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole nations owned enslaved African Americans, working fields of cotton and other crops. Others, however, opposed slavery, seeing it as a betrayal of traditional values. These differences would soon become fault lines when the nation itself split apart. When the Southern states seceded, Confederate leaders looked westward. Indian Territory held strategic importance. It was a buffer between Texas and Union-controlled Kansas, and its lands could provide food and resources for the Confederate cause. Confederate officials courted the leaders of the 5 tribes, promising protection, recognition of tribal sovereignty, and representation in the Confederate Congress. For tribes who still felt the sting of betrayal by the U.S. government, these promises were tempting. The Confederacy found eager allies among some tribal leaders. and the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations, where support for slavery was strongest. Leaders quickly signed treaties aligning with the South. The Creek, Seminole, and Cherokee, however, were divided. Within the Cherokee Nation, Principal Chief John Ross initially sought neutrality, urging his people not to take sides. But his rival, Stand Watie, a wealthy slaveholder, threw his support behind the Confederacy. Soon, the Cherokee Nation itself split in two, with Ross eventually pressured into signing a treaty with the South while many of his people sided with the Union. As alliances fractured, Indian Territory became a battleground. Battles were fought not only between Union and Confederate forces, but also between native factions. Families and communities were torn apart, neighbors taking up arms against one another. For many, the Civil War was less about North versus South and more about survival, loyalty, and the bitter divisions within their own nations. One of the earliest major engagements in Indian Territory was the Battle of Round Mountain in November 1861. Unionist Creek and Seminole, led by Chief Opothleyahole, attempted to flee northward to Kansas to escape Confederate control. Pursued by Confederate-aligned native forces, they clashed at Round Mountain, then again at Chustautalasa and Chustanala. Thousands of men, women, and children endured freezing conditions and relentless pursuit. Many died before reaching safety in Kansas, their suffering remembered as the trail of blood on ice. Other battles soon followed. At the Battle of Honey Springs in July 1863, Union forces under Major General James G. Blunt defeated a Confederate army that included large numbers of native soldiers. Fought near present-day Chakotah, Honey Springs was the largest battle in Indian Territory and a turning point in securing Union control of the region. African-American troops of the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry played a crucial role in the victory, marking one of the earliest instances of black soldiers proving their valor in the Civil War. Throughout the territory, the war devastated communities. Farms were burned, towns destroyed, and families displaced. Refugees fled in all directions, many seeking shelter in Kansas or Texas. Hunger and disease spread, and the once thriving rebuilt societies of the 5 tribes fell into chaos. By war's end, Indian Territory lay shattered, its people exhausted, its land scarred. For native nations, the consequences of the war were profound. Those who had allied with the Confederacy found themselves punished by the victorious Union. New treaties stripped them of land, reduced their sovereignty, and demanded the emancipation of enslaved people. The Cherokee Nation, deeply divided by its wartime loyalties, faced years of bitter Reconstruction. The Choctaw and Chickasaw, who had most strongly supported the Confederacy, lost significant portions of their land. Yet out of this devastation came new realities. Freedmen, formerly enslaved African Americans within the 5 tribes, gained recognition as citizens in some nations, though not without controversy and resistance. The federal government, emboldened by its victory, asserted greater control over Indian Territory, opening the door to future settlement and the erosion of promises once made. The Civil War in Indian Territory was unlike any other front in the conflict. It was not only a clash of Union and Confederacy, but also of neighbor against neighbor, of tribe against tribe, of the old world against the new. It left wounds that would take generations to heal, shaping the destiny of Oklahoma long after the last shots were fired. as the smoke of war cleared in 1865. Indian Territory stood at a crossroads. The 5 tribes had endured removal and now civil war, yet they remained. Their nations were battered but alive. Their resilience tested yet unbroken. But their sovereignty had been further weakened, their lands diminished, and their future increasingly tied to the designs of the United States. The years that followed would bring new challenges: railroads, cattle drives, and the encroachment of settlers. The frontier was no longer a distant borderland. It was becoming the center of America's westward expansion. And Indian Territory, once promised as a permanent home for native peoples, would soon face pressures that would transform it forever. The Civil War left Indian Territory devastated. Fields lay abandoned, towns burned, and thousands of people displaced. Hunger and disease haunted the land, and political divisions within tribes cut deep wounds that would take decades to heal. For the 5 tribes and the many other native nations living in the territory, the war had not only destroyed lives and property, it had also changed their standing with the United States forever. The Union's victory in 1865 meant a harsh reckoning for those who had allied with the Confederacy. Federal officials moved quickly to impose new treaties on the tribes, summoning their leaders to Washington in 1866. The terms were severe. Large sections of land, particularly in western Indian Territory, were ceded to the United States. These lands would later be used to resettle Plains tribes such as the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Kiowa, and Comanche, who had been defeated in wars on the Great Plains. The Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole were forced to accept emancipation of their enslaved people. And in many cases, freedmen were granted citizenship within the tribes, creating new and sometimes bitter debates over identity and belonging. The post-war treaties marked a turning point. The promise that Indian Territory would be a permanent homeland for the 5 tribes was already eroding. Now, with the cession of western lands, the door was open for further intrusion. The government framed the treaties as punishment for siding with the Confederacy, but they also reflected America's growing appetite for westward expansion. Indian Territory was no longer seen as an isolated refuge. It was becoming a crossroads of national ambition. Into this fragile landscape came the railroad. By the 1870s, rail lines were pushing westward across the continent, binding the nation together after the divisions of war. Indian Territory, situated between Texas and Kansas, was a natural corridor. Railroad companies lobbied Congress for rights of way through the territory, and soon steel tracks cut across tribal lands. The railroads brought goods, people, and opportunity. But they also carried the seeds of deeper change. With the trains came cattle drives, settlers, and speculators, all eager to profit from the opening frontier. The cattle trade became one of the most visible signs of intrusion. After the war, Texas ranchers found northern markets hungry for beef. Trails like the Chisholm Trail and the Great Western Cattle Trail ran northward, crossing Indian Territory on the way to railheads in Kansas. For years, herds numbering in the hundreds of thousands passed through Oklahoma, driven by cowboys who endured long, dusty journeys. The cattle brought wealth to some tribes, who collected grazing fees. But they also brought disruption, trampled fields, disease, and conflict with local communities. As the cattle drives passed through, towns began to spring up along the routes. Trading posts turned into boom towns, catering to cowboys, traders, and drifters. Indian Territory, once envisioned as a sanctuary closed to outsiders, became a place of constant movement and exchange. With every passing year, the boundary between tribal sovereignty and American expansion blurred a little more. Another sign of change was the growing presence of law enforcement, or, more often, the lack of it. Indian Territory gained a reputation as a haven for outlaws, who slipped across its borders to escape justice in Kansas, Texas, or Arkansas. The absence of clear legal authority made the region dangerous. To address this, the U.S. established a federal court at Fort Smith, Arkansas, under the jurisdiction of Judge Isaac Parker, later known as the Hanging Judge. From his courtroom, Parker sentenced dozens of criminals to death and sent U.S. Marshals deep into Indian Territory to pursue fugitives. Their work was dangerous, and many lost their lives in the effort to bring order to the frontier. For the native nations themselves, the Reconstruction era was one of rebuilding under constant pressure. Tribal governments sought to restore stability, re-establish schools, and revive economies damaged by war. Leaders debated how to integrate freedmen and how to navigate the demands of the U.S. government. Internal divisions lingered, especially among the Cherokee, where wartime loyalties had split the nation between Unionists and Confederates. Yet despite these challenges, Native communities persisted. Towns grew, farms once again produced crops, and new generations went to school. The resilience of the 5 tribes was remarkable, but their sovereignty was under siege. Each new treaty, each railroad line, each encroachment of cattle drives chipped away at the vision of Indian Territory as a secure homeland. The 1880s brought even greater change. The railroads expanded further, and talk of opening Indian Territory to white settlement grew louder. Boomers, settlers eager to claim land in Oklahoma, began to agitate for access. They argued that much of the land, particularly the so-called unassigned lands in central Oklahoma, was unused and should be open to homesteaders under the federal government's land policies. For the tribes, this agitation was a direct threat to their autonomy. For the U.S. government, it was a convenient excuse to accelerate its plans for expansion. By the close of the 1880s, Indian Territory was no longer the isolated refuge envisioned half a century earlier. It was a land of railroads and cattle trails, of growing towns and restless outsiders. Native nations remained, but their sovereignty was increasingly overshadowed by federal authority and by the ceaseless push of settlers on every border. The Reconstruction era had begun with promises of rebuilding and renewal, but it ended with Indian Territory more vulnerable than ever. The tribes had endured removal, war, and now intrusion, yet they still held on to their identity and culture. But the storm clouds of change were gathering. Soon the boomers would pour into the unassigned lands, and the first great land run would change Oklahoma forever. By the late 1880s, pressure on Indian Territory had reached a breaking point. For decades, the United States had promised that this land would remain a permanent home for Native nations. Yet in practice, treaty after treaty had chipped away at sovereignty and land. Railroads crisscrossed the prairies, cattle trails carved deep ruts across open country, and settlers in neighboring states looked hungrily across the border. The Indian problem, as officials called it, was being replaced by what newspapers now referred to as the Oklahoma problem. Americans wanted the land, and they would not be denied. The focus of their desire was the unassigned lands. These were nearly 2 million acres in central Oklahoma, land once promised to tribes who had been removed from the East but never settled. After the Civil War, these lands reverted to federal control, and by the 1880s, settlers argued they were public domain. Organized groups known as boomers, led by fiery figures like David L. Payne and William Couch, began to demand that the government open the land to homesteaders. They insisted that the soil was rich, the climate favorable, and that the land was being wasted by remaining closed. The boomers did more than talk. They staged incursions, crossing illegally into the unassigned lands to stake claims. Federal troops repeatedly expelled them, but each removal only drew more attention to their cause. Newspapers across the country covered the clashes, and pressure mounted on Washington to resolve the issue. By 1889, the government relented. President Benjamin Harrison announced that the unassigned lands would be open to settlement. Through one of the most dramatic experiments in American history. At noon on April 22, 1889, a cannon blast signaled the start of the first Oklahoma land run. Tens of thousands of settlers, men, women, and children, lined the borders of the unassigned lands, waiting with wagons, horses, and on foot. When the signal came, they surged forward in a frenzy, racing to claim 160-acre homesteads. Dust clouds filled the air, wagons overturned, horses collapsed, and people risked their lives for the chance at a new beginning. By nightfall, towns had sprung up almost instantly. Oklahoma City, Guthrie, Norman, and Stillwater. Each built on claims staked in the chaos of the day. The land run of 1889 captured the imagination of the nation. Newspapers described it as a spectacle of courage and determination, a testament to the pioneer spirit. But beneath the romance was a harsher truth. The land was not empty. It had been taken from native nations, once again undermining promises that Indian territory would remain untouched. For the tribes, the land runs were another painful chapter in the long erosion of sovereignty. The success of the first run led to more. In the following years, additional land runs opened vast sections of Oklahoma territory. The 1891 runs opened the Sac and Fox, Iowa, and Pottawatomie lands. In 1893, the Cherokee Outlet, nearly 7 million acres in northern Oklahoma, was thrown open in the largest land run of all. Once again, tens of thousands lined up, surging forward at the sound of gunfire to claim farms and town sites. Guthrie, Perry, Enid, and other towns swelled overnight. The frenzy of the runs became legendary, part of Oklahoma's identity, celebrated in song, story, and later in film. Not all land distribution was through runs. Some lands were opened through lotteries or sealed bid auctions, methods designed to bring more order to the chaotic process. But the symbolism of the land runs remained powerful. They represented to many Americans the closing of the frontier, the last great rush for free land. To native peoples, they symbolized another betrayal, another invasion of lands once guaranteed to remain theirs forever. Life for the settlers who claimed these lands was not easy. The fertile soil promised opportunity, but it came at the cost of backbreaking labor. Homesteaders built sod houses, endured droughts and harsh winters, and fought grasshopper plagues. Towns grew quickly, but law and order often lagged behind. Disputes over claims led to violence, and Sooners, those who had slipped into the land early to stake the best plots, were both condemned and celebrated. The word itself became synonymous with Oklahoma, eventually adopted as the state's nickname. By the close of the 1890s, the transformation of Oklahoma was undeniable. Indian territory still existed in the east, where the 5 tribes maintained control. But Oklahoma Territory in the west had been carved from land runs and settlement. Railroads connected the towns, schools and newspapers flourished, and the population boomed. What had once been envisioned as a permanent Indian homeland was now firmly on the path toward statehood. The land runs were a turning point. They marked the triumph of expansion over promises, of settlers over treaties. They created communities and opportunities for thousands of families, but at the cost of native sovereignty and land. The image of wagons racing across open prairies, settlers staking their claims at the stroke of noon, became a symbol of Oklahoma's frontier spirit. Yet beneath the dust and legend lay the truth. The land runs were built on dispossession, and the legacy of those broken promises continues to echo through Oklahoma's history. As the 19th century drew to a close, the people of Oklahoma, native and settler alike, looked toward a new century. For some, it was a time of opportunity, of towns rising and farms flourishing. For others, it was a time of loss, of traditions uprooted and lands stolen. The stage was set for the next chapter in the state's story, the struggle for statehood, the discovery of oil, and the promise and peril of modernity. By the dawn of the 20th century, Oklahoma stood at a crossroads. Indian territory in the east, with its tribal governments and native communities, existed alongside Oklahoma Territory in the west, settled by homesteaders through land runs and lotteries. 2 distinct worlds shared one land, each with its own laws, institutions, and traditions. But pressure was mounting for unification. The United States, having expanded from coast to coast, looked to bring order to the patchwork of governance in the center of the continent. The time had come, many argued, to make Oklahoma a state. The road to statehood was long and contentious. Native leaders in Indian Territory resisted, wary of losing the sovereignty they had fought so hard to preserve. They proposed instead the creation of a separate state called Sequoia, named for the Cherokee scholar who had developed the Cherokee syllabary. In 1905, delegates from the 5 tribes met in Muskogee to draft a constitution for the state of Sequoia. Their effort was serious and sophisticated, producing a document that laid out a framework for governance, rights, and institutions. The proposal even gained support from many in Congress, but ultimately it was rejected. The federal government had no intention of allowing 2 separate states to emerge from Oklahoma. The fate of Indian Territory would be bound to its western neighbor. In 1907, Congress passed the Oklahoma Enabling Act, paving the way for the 2 territories to unite as a single state. On November 16th, President Theodore Roosevelt signed the proclamation admitting Oklahoma as the 46th state in the Union. Across the new state, celebrations erupted. Guthrie, the first capital, hosted ceremonies, and newspapers declared it the birth of a new era. For settlers, statehood symbolized legitimacy, opportunity, and progress. For many native peoples, it was a bitter reminder of promises broken, their governments dissolved, and their lands increasingly under federal and state control. The early years of statehood were marked by both progress and tension. Oklahoma grew rapidly, its population swelling as settlers poured in. Towns expanded, farms multiplied, and railroads crisscrossed the plains. The discovery of oil added a new dimension. In places like Tulsa, Bartlesville, and Oklahoma City, oil wells gushed black gold, transforming quiet towns into booming cities almost overnight. Fortunes were made, and Oklahoma gained a reputation as one of the richest oil regions in the world. Tulsa, in particular, became known as the oil capital of the world, attracting entrepreneurs, workers, and speculators from across the country. Oil wealth brought both prosperity and corruption. Politicians courted oilmen, and battles over mineral rights and royalties became common. For some Native families, particularly members of the Osage Nation in northeastern Oklahoma, oil brought immense wealth. Under federal law, head rights to oil royalties were assigned to tribal members, making the Osage among the wealthiest people in America during the 1920s. But this prosperity also drew exploitation, manipulation, and violence, culminating in the infamous Osage murders, where dozens of tribal members were killed for their oil money. Beyond oil, Oklahoma's early years reflected the broader currents of American society. The state's constitution was one of the most progressive in the nation at the time, including provisions for regulation of corporations, protection of workers, and the initiative and referendum process. Yet, it also entrenched segregation and racial inequality. Jim Crow laws restricted African Americans, and violence against black communities scarred the state's history. The most horrific example came in 1921 with the Tulsa Race Massacre. In the prosperous Greenwood district of Tulsa, known as Black Wall Street, a thriving African American community of doctors, lawyers, entrepreneurs, and families had built a model of success despite segregation. But on May 31st and June 1st, white mobs, fueled by racism and false accusations, descended upon Greenwood. Over the course of 2 days, they burned homes and businesses, murdered residents, and left thousands homeless. Airplanes even dropped incendiary devices from above, one of the only times in U.S. history such tactics were used against civilians. The massacre destroyed one of the most prosperous black communities in America, and for decades, it was deliberately erased from history books. Only in recent years has the truth begun to be fully acknowledged and remembered. Despite such tragedies, the early 20th century was also a time of cultural flowering in Oklahoma. Native nations continued to preserve traditions while adapting to new realities. Powwows, ceremonies, and language preservation remained vital, even as federal policies sought assimilation. Settlers built schools, churches, and civic institutions, establishing a sense of permanence in towns that had once been little more than tent cities. By the 1920s, Oklahoma had firmly taken its place in the Union. It was a land of contradictions, rich in oil yet scarred by inequality, proud of its frontier spirit yet haunted by broken promises. Its people were diverse, drawn from native nations, African American freedmen, European immigrants, and settlers from across the country. Together, they forged a new identity, one that was still taking shape amid triumphs and tragedies. The early years of statehood were not a peaceful settling into stability. They were turbulent, marked by rapid growth, cultural clashes, and social upheaval. Yet they laid the foundation for the Oklahoma we know today, a state defined by resilience, complexity, and a history that refuses to be forgotten. The 1930s were a time of hardship across America. But for Oklahoma, the decade would be defined by one of the most devastating environmental and human crises in its history. The Dust Bowl. Combined with the crushing weight of the Great Depression, these years left an indelible mark on the land and its people, shaping Oklahoma's identity for generations to come. The roots of the Dust Bowl stretched back decades. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, settlers had plowed millions of acres of prairie to plant wheat. Encouraged by high prices during World War I, farmers expanded further, breaking the sod that had held the soil in place for centuries. In good years, the wheat harvest seemed endless. Oklahoma became part of the breadbasket of the world. But the plowing came at a cost. When drought returned in the 1930s, the fragile soil, no longer anchored by native grasses, turned to dust. What followed was environmental catastrophe. Winds swept across the plains, lifting the dry soil into towering clouds that blotted out the sun. These dust storms, known as black blizzards, could rise thousands of feet into the air and stretch for miles. They rolled across the land with terrifying force, turning day into night, coating everything in fine grit and suffocating crops and livestock. Families stuffed wet cloths into cracks in their houses, covered their mouths with rags, and prayed for relief. Yet the storms came again and again. Oklahoma was at the heart of the Dust Bowl. In towns across the Panhandle and Western Plains, life became a daily struggle against the dust. Children developed dust pneumonia. Livestock starved as pastures withered, and farmers watched helplessly as their fields turned barren. Entire communities faced ruin. In some years, as much as 3/4 of Oklahoma's topsoil blew away, carried eastward to settle on distant cities. One storm in 1934 carried an estimated 350 million tons of dirt all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. The Dust Bowl coincided with the Great Depression, compounding the suffering. Wheat prices collapsed, banks foreclosed on farms, and families lost everything. For many Oklahomans, the only option was to leave. Tens of thousands packed up what little they could carry and headed west, joining the Great Migration to California and other states. These migrants, often called Okies, regardless of whether they came from Oklahoma or other Dust Bowl states, became symbols of hardship and resilience. Their journey was famously captured in John Steinbeck's novel, The Grapes of Wrath, which told the story of the Joad family fleeing Oklahoma for California. While fictional, the novel reflected real experiences. Migrant families often traveled along Route 66, the Mother Road, which cut across Oklahoma and carried them westward. In California, they faced discrimination, low wages, and harsh living conditions in labor camps. Yet they endured, their struggles highlighting the broader injustices of the era. Not all left. Many Oklahomans chose to stay, determined to outlast the storms. Communities pulled together, neighbors sharing what little food and water they had. Churches, schools, and relief organizations offered support. The federal government, under President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, launched programs to combat the crisis. The Soil Conservation Service promoted new farming techniques to preserve topsoil, planting shelter belts of trees to break the wind and encouraging crop rotation. Over time, these measures began to restore the land, though the recovery was slow and incomplete. Despite the hardship, the Dust Bowl forged a spirit of resilience. Families learned to survive with less, to rely on one another, and to endure against overwhelming odds. Songs, stories, and photographs from the era captured both the suffering and the strength of the people. The haunting images taken by Dorothea Lange and others, showing dust-covered families and weary children, became icons of the Depression, shaping America's understanding of the crisis. By the end of the 1930s, rains gradually returned and new farming practices began to stabilize the soil. The worst of the Dust Bowl had passed, but its legacy endured. For Oklahoma, it was a reminder of the delicate balance between land and people, of the dangers of overuse, and of the resilience required to endure hardship. The Dust Bowl also left its mark on the nation's culture, inspiring art, literature, and music that spoke to the struggles of ordinary people. The 1930s tested Oklahoma as never before. Yet even in the face of drought, dust, and depression, the people endured. Some left in search of hope elsewhere, others stayed and rebuilt from the dust. Together, they carried forward a story of endurance that became central to Oklahoma's identity. As the decade closed, new challenges loomed. The world was sliding toward war, and once again, Oklahoma would find itself playing a vital role. But the lessons of the Dust Bowl remained, a warning and a testament to the resilience of those who called this land home. As the 1930s faded into memory, Oklahomans carried with them the scars of dust and poverty, but also a hard-earned resilience. The new decade brought a global conflict that would once again transform the state. When World War II erupted, Oklahoma stepped onto the national stage, not as a place of despair, but as a vital contributor to America's war effort and, afterward, to a post-war boom that reshaped daily life. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, young men from every corner of Oklahoma rushed to enlist. From the wheat fields of the Panhandle to the oil towns of the East, families sent their sons, and in many cases their daughters, into uniform. Thousands of Oklahomans served in every branch of the military, fighting in the Pacific Islands, across Europe, and on the seas. Many never returned, and their sacrifice is still honored in memorials and cemeteries across the state. Oklahoma itself became a training ground for war. The wide open spaces and central location made it ideal for military bases. Camp Gruber near Muskogee, Tinker Field near Oklahoma City, and Altus Army Airfield were among many installations that sprang to life. Young recruits marched, drilled, and flew over Oklahoma skies. Preparing for battles overseas, for many rural towns, the bases brought new jobs and economic activity, linking them directly to the global struggle. The state's oil fields also fueled the war. Petroleum was the lifeblood of modern warfare, powering tanks, planes, and ships. And Oklahoma's wells pumped tirelessly to meet demand. Roughnecks and drillers worked around the clock, and the wealth from oil poured into the state. Factories, too, shifted to wartime production, building equipment, ammunition, and vehicles. Women joined the workforce in record numbers, echoing the national story of Rosie the Riveter. World War II also accelerated change for Native communities in Oklahoma. Native men enlisted at high rates, serving with distinction. The Comanche code talkers, like their Navajo counterparts, used their language to transmit secure communications on the battlefield, baffling enemy code breakers. Their role remained little known for decades, but their contributions were vital. For many Native veterans, the war also broadened horizons, exposing them to new opportunities and challenges beyond Indian country. When the war ended in 1945, Oklahoma, like the rest of the nation, shifted to peace. The return of veterans sparked a housing boom. The GI Bill helped thousands attend college, buy homes, and start businesses. Towns grew rapidly, and suburban neighborhoods spread outward from cities. Oklahoma City and Tulsa expanded, their skylines rising with new offices, banks, and hotels. Highways stretched across the plains, connecting communities and fueling commerce. The oil industry continued to dominate, bringing prosperity but also volatility. Boom years brought wealth, while bust years reminded Oklahomans of the cycle's dangers. Still, oil funded schools, hospitals, and civic projects, and Oklahoma remained a pillar of America's energy supply. Agriculture, too, recovered, though many farms became larger and more mechanized, reducing the number of small family farms that had once dotted the countryside. Culturally, the post-war years were a time of both pride and struggle. Oklahoma celebrated its contributions to the war and embraced modernity. Drive-in theaters, rock and roll music, and new technologies became part of daily life. At the same time, social tensions simmered. Segregation remained entrenched, and the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s brought change to Oklahoma, as it did across the South. Black students challenged segregation in schools and public spaces, and activists demanded equality in jobs, housing, and voting. For Native communities, the post-war era brought another round of federal policy shifts. The government pursued termination policies, aiming to dissolve tribal governments and assimilate Native peoples fully into American society. In Oklahoma, where dozens of tribes have been relocated, the policy struck particularly hard. Yet, Native leaders resisted, organizing to preserve sovereignty and culture. Their efforts laid the groundwork for the resurgence of tribal nations in the decades to come. The 1940s through the 1960s were transformative years for Oklahoma. From the battlefields of World War II to the prosperity of the post-war boom, the state emerged from its Dust Bowl past into a modern era. Cities grew, industries thrived, and the people adapted once more to sweeping change. Yet beneath the prosperity lay challenges: racial inequality, cultural survival, and economic instability that would shape the state's journey into the late 20th century. As the 1960s came to a close, Oklahoma stood at the edge of another transformation. The optimism of the post-war boom was giving way to new uncertainties: economic, political, and cultural. But the resilience forged in dust storms and wars remained, ready to face whatever came next. By the 1970s, Oklahoma was a state in transition. The scars of the Dust Bowl and Depression had faded, the boom of oil wealth had reshaped cities, and the optimism of the post-war years had built suburbs, highways, and a modern economy. Yet, as America entered a turbulent new era of social change, economic shifts, and political upheaval, Oklahoma too found itself redefining its place in the nation. The oil industry continued to dominate the state's identity and economy. In the 1970s, global events, particularly the energy crisis triggered by Middle Eastern conflicts, sent oil prices soaring. For Oklahoma, this was a boom of historic proportions. Wells that had once been marginal suddenly produced fortunes. Tulsa and Oklahoma City thrived, their skylines dotted with new office towers. Banks flourished, real estate values climbed, and oilmen once again embodied the image of Oklahoma prosperity. Ranches expanded, and lavish mansions rose, fueled by the black gold beneath the soil. But the boom carried risks. By the 1980s, the cycle turned. Oil prices collapsed, and with them went jobs, investments, and dreams. Banks failed, families lost businesses, and foreclosures swept across the state. The once booming oil towns suffered, and Oklahoma entered one of its worst recessions since the 1930s. The oil bust became a defining memory for an entire generation, a harsh reminder of the volatility of dependence on a single resource. Alongside economic turbulence came cultural and social change. Oklahoma in the 1970s and 1980s reflected the wider transformations sweeping the nation. The civil rights movement had broken legal segregation, but the struggle for equality continued. African American leaders pushed for fair housing, job opportunities, and representation. Native nations, too, were experiencing a renaissance. After decades of federal attempts at termination and assimilation, the 1970s ushered in a new era of sovereignty and self-determination. Tribes in Oklahoma reclaimed political power, built institutions, and began economic ventures that laid the foundation for future growth. Education and culture thrived in these decades. Universities expanded, attracting students from across the country. The arts flourished, with theaters, museums, and music scenes reflecting Oklahoma's diverse heritage. Country music remained a powerful force, with artists like Reba McEntire and Garth Brooks rising to national fame, carrying the sound of Oklahoma to audiences around the world. The 1990s brought both tragedy and resilience. On April 19, 1995, Oklahoma City was rocked by the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in American history. A massive truck bomb exploded outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, killing 168 people, including children in a daycare center, and injuring hundreds more. The Oklahoma City bombing shocked the nation, a reminder of vulnerability not from foreign enemies, but from within. Yet, in the aftermath, Oklahomans displayed extraordinary unity. Rescue workers, volunteers, and neighbors came together in what became known as the Oklahoma Standard. A spirit of compassion, resilience, and service that continues to define the state's response to tragedy. In politics, Oklahoma reflected national shifts toward conservatism in the 1980s and 1990s. Leaders emphasized traditional values, energy independence, and business development. Yet the state also grappled with challenges: poverty, underfunded schools, and health disparities that revealed the limits of growth and prosperity. By the close of the 20th century, Oklahoma had become a state of contrasts. It was modern, connected to the global economy, proud of its contributions in energy, agriculture, and culture. Yet it remained rooted in its past, shaped by the resilience of native peoples, the struggles of pioneers, and the hardships of dust, war, and economic upheaval. The decades from the 1970s through the 1990s were ones of reinvention. Oklahoma faced booms and busts, tragedy and triumph, decline and renewal. Its people adapted, endured, and pressed forward, carrying with them the lessons of history and the promise of the future. As the millennium approached, Oklahoma entered a new chapter, Technology, globalization, and new industries were reshaping the world. For a state forged in frontier struggle and frontier resilience, the 21st century would bring both challenges and opportunities. But the Oklahoma spirit, tested time and again, remained ready. As the 21st century dawned, Oklahoma carried forward a legacy of resilience shaped by centuries of upheaval, adaptation, and perseverance. From native homelands to Indian territory, from land runs to statehood, from dust storms to oil booms, Oklahoma's past was etched with both triumph and tragedy. Now, in a new millennium, the state faced fresh challenges and opportunities, stepping into an era defined by technology, globalization, and shifting identities. One of the most significant changes came from the continuing resurgence of native nations. After decades of struggle, tribes across Oklahoma reclaimed sovereignty and built thriving economies. Casinos and gaming enterprises became cornerstones of tribal revenue, funding schools, healthcare, housing, and cultural preservation. Nations like the Cherokee, Chickasaw, and Choctaw expanded their influence not only in Oklahoma, but nationally, investing in businesses, sponsoring cultural events, and revitalizing languages and traditions once thought endangered. For Native communities, the 21st century marked a period of renewal, a reminder that despite centuries of removal and broken promises, their cultures endured and flourished. Oklahoma's cities also entered a new phase. Oklahoma City, long seen as a modest capital, transformed dramatically after the 1995 bombing. The tragedy galvanized investment in urban renewal, and by the early 2000s, projects like the MAPS initiatives reshaped the city's landscape. A revitalized downtown, new arenas, and the arrival of professional sports, the NBA's Oklahoma City Thunder, brought fresh energy and pride. Tulsa, once the oil capital of the world, reinvented itself as a hub for arts, culture, and education. With investments in its riverfront, museums, and music heritage. Together, the state's two largest cities became symbols of resilience and reinvention. The energy industry remained central, though no longer as dominant as in the past. Oil and natural gas continued to shape the economy, but new technologies like hydraulic fracturing or fracking sparked both boom years and environmental concerns. Earthquakes, once rare in Oklahoma, became more common, raising questions about the costs of energy extraction. At the same time, the state explored wind power, becoming one of the nation's leaders in renewable energy. Its wide plains dotted with turbines spinning in the Oklahoma wind. Culturally, Oklahoma entered the global stage. Country music stars like Garth Brooks and Blake Shelton carried the state's sound worldwide, while artists, writers, and filmmakers told new stories rooted in Oklahoma soil. Indigenous creators gained visibility, with works like the acclaimed television series Reservation Dogs bringing native voices and humor into the mainstream. Festivals, powwows, and community events showcased a diverse identity, blending native, African American, European, Latino, and Asian influences into a rich cultural mosaic. Yet the new century also brought challenges. Tornadoes and severe weather remained a constant threat, testing the state's resilience each spring. Economic inequality persisted, with rural communities often struggling while cities boomed. Education and healthcare systems faced ongoing strain, sparking debates over funding, reform, and the state's future direction. Politically, Oklahoma became one of the most conservative states in the nation, with leaders emphasizing energy independence, traditional values, and limited government. National tragedies once again touched Oklahoma. The memory of the Murrah building bombing remained vivid, but new generations grew up with different crises: terrorism, wars overseas, and the COVID-19 pandemic. Through it all, the Oklahoma Standard re-emerged time and again. Neighbors helping neighbors, communities rallying in the face of disaster, and a spirit of resilience that seemed as much a part of the landscape as the wind itself. By the 2000s, Oklahoma stood as a state of contrasts. It was both deeply rooted in its past and boldly looking to the future. Its cities thrived, while its rural towns held fast to traditions. Its native nations flourished alongside communities shaped by pioneers, immigrants, and migrants who had come from every corner of the world. Its economy balanced old energy with new technologies, agriculture with innovation. And its culture continued to evolve, celebrating both heritage and progress. Oklahoma in the 21st century is not defined by a single story, but by many. It is the story of native nations reclaiming their place, the story of cities rising from tragedy into renewal, the story of farmers, oilmen, artists, and teachers carrying forward resilience through each new challenge. It is the story of a people who have endured storms, dust, war, economic collapse, and violence, and who continue to stand, rooted in the red earth, eyes on the horizon. As the new century unfolds, Oklahoma's journey continues. Its past is never far behind, shaping identity and memory. Its future remains unwritten, carried forward by the same resilience that has defined it for centuries. For in Oklahoma, history is not just something remembered. It is something lived, day by day, in every community, every storm endured, and every hope carried into tomorrow.